Good evening, everyone. Watching the participants come in. Fabulous. Good evening, everyone. We have 21 attendees so far. Wonderful. Okay. One more minute, and then we will begin. Just letting people come on. Good evening. Okay, we reached 25 participants now, so we're going to begin. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Delaware Valley chapter of the Links Incorporated Symposium on the Disparities in Education for Black and Brown Children. Prior to introducing the panelists, I want to introduce our president, Dr. Sean Blue, who will give us a welcome.
Good evening. I am Dr. Sean Blue, and I am the current president of the Delaware Valley PA chapter of the Links Incorporated. The Links Incorporated, an international nonprofit corporation, was established in 1946 in Philadelphia, PA, by Margaret Roselle Hawkins and Sarah Strickland Scott to respond to the needs of African Americans in the aftermath of World War II. The vision of this organization originated with the idea of a group of clubs composed of friends. Membership of the Links Incorporated has grown to over 16,000 professional women of color. 18 years after the first chapter was organized and sponsored by the Philadelphia chapter, the Links Incorporated recognized and installed the Delaware Valley chapter on November 21st, 1964. Our organization is one that is based on friendship and community service. Our chapter and organization focus on providing programming and financial donations in the areas of health and human services, the arts, youth, historically Black colleges and universities, as well as meeting national and international needs. This year, we are focusing on the multiple disparities that exist and have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. The Services to Youth Committee that is sponsoring this symposium today is spotlighting the disparities that exist within education for African American and Latino children. And now I will turn it over to our esteemed chapter members who are the co-chairs of this committee, Malika Savoy-Brooks and Kim Hutchins. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I'm Malika Savoy-Brooks, co-chair for Services to Youth. And Kim?
I'm Kim Hutchins, and also co-chair of Services to Youth.
We also have Bernice Henry, who is the member of the HBCU committee, who are supporting us in the symposium. I would like to introduce our panelists now. When I say your name, just wave so that people can see you. April Brown is a principal in the Philadelphia School District. Dr. Latanya King is a therapist and psychologist. Dr. Tony Damon is a principal in the School District of Philadelphia. I apologize. April is the principal of Waring. Dr. Tony Damon is the principal of Dobbins High School. Allie Robinson Rogers is the executive director of post-secondary readiness in the School District of Philadelphia. Zara Adams is the director of community engagement. Dr. Dave Thomas is the associate dean. I can't see it, Dave.
Associate Vice President.
Associate Vice President, thank you. Siobhan Savage is Deputy Chief of the Office of Specialized Services in the School District of Philadelphia. Dana King is the Chief Academic Officer for Universal. And Christina Grant is Chief of Charters for the School District of Philadelphia. Dr. Milka Batista is Executive Director of Multilingual Programs. Welcome, panelists, and I thank you and appreciate your participation tonight. I'm looking forward to you using your professional knowledge to support our focus on eradicating disparities and inequity in education. So the first question that I have for the panel is, well, the first request that I have for the panel is for you to define what disparities and inequities mean in education. So I would like for each panelist to share, what does that really mean to you, disparities and inequities in education? And I'm going to begin with April.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. I think for me, disparities in education, in short, is the unjust distribution of resources, just across the board. That could include how funding is allocated within a school district, how we get it from the government, to individual schools getting Title I funds and how those funds are used, to distorted priorities and the unwillingness of a school district to actually acknowledge the inequities. So I think in short, it's just the unjust distribution of resources, and it leads to immobility.
Thank you. Latanya?
So thank you. So I'm going to keep going with that access piece of it. So for me, as a college professor, I see the lack of access to people, places, and things. And particularly when I have incoming freshmen or even sophomores, sometimes seniors, they have missed out on so much as a part of their educational journey to get to college because of that limited access that they have had within their own home community, their home school, and surrounding environment. So our brown children are missing out on those people, places, and things that help us to be successful.
Thank you. And I hope no one mind me by calling them that by their first name. Tony?
So just continuing on in that same vein, for me, it's the just the huge unfair practice, of course, what April said, but also adding on lack of opportunities and partnerships for young people of color, that they're not getting in front of the right people at the right time to make the right decisions is what I would add to that.
Thank you. Allie, what do you think?
I think I agree. I think the only component that that I would add is additional to kind of Dr. Damon and students not having access to adequate resources to ensure that they are on a level playing field. I think it's consider even with the minority students. I mean, in Philadelphia, 2/3 of our minority students attend schools that are mostly minority, right? And ensuring that they all have the same level of access to information, resources, and supports is where we see disparities and equities in education arising.
Thank you. Zara?
Good evening. I'm Dr. Zara Adams, Director of Community Engagement from the Germantown Friends School. For students who attend independent or private schools, disparities and inequities in education may be defined as a minority student in a majority white school. These disparities are especially highlighted at an educational institution with predominantly white upper class families and a school with a history of upper class culture. The psychological price for some students facing these disparities and inequities could include social loneliness, racial visibility, class and cultural discomfort, and the burden of constantly explaining themselves to white people.
Thank you. Dave?
I think everyone has provided a really, really solid foundation in terms of what disparities and inequities mean and look like in our institutions. At a community college, I want to speak, but I think this is also, I think, specific to K-12. Principal Brown mentioned the unjust, right? And that was kind of what started it. And I think the reality is what undergirds the unjust approach to anything are very often the unjust expectations that one has around a particular body of student or population of student or demographic. And I do think when we're talking about inequities and disparities and how they impact individuals, communities, students of color, we have to talk about the expectation. And why do you even feel as though providing unjust resources or unjust distribution of resources is okay for this population? Again, that gets to the core of what I think this entire panel is about. But really, I think we're remiss if we're not having a conversation about expectations, and the root of those expectations been talking about disparities and inequities.
True. Siobhan?
I think for me, just extending upon what Dave just said, it's really like the purposeful and intentional and systematic way that our society and our country has really set up our education system, because in essence, we have endeavored to maintain a caste system that this country was built upon. And when we talk about inequities and disparities in education, we oftentimes focus on particular communities or what's going on in one school or one system. But the issue is not just isolated to a single community, it's systematic. When you talk about private schools versus charter schools versus public schools versus religious schools, the intent behind the legislation that has really segregated our school system was to maintain these disparities. And in our work as educators, looking at that, what does it mean for us to dismantle it?
Right. Firing me up. Okay, Dana. You're on mute, Dana.
I'll just echo everyone and just say this. It's not just unjust, it is historic and illegal in a nation that claims to have a democracy, right? And so in order to have disparities and inequities, you had to have started out with inequality. So we're looking at generational, systemic, illegitimate discrimination that led to the disparities and inequities that we're discussing today. And I'm going to always come from the perspective of the fact that it's a violation. It's a fundamental right violation. Every child deserves a quality, high quality education, and we have to start. And I think Attorney Savage started her point this way. The United States Constitution does not guarantee the right to a quality education. That right was fought for by African Americans and Latino Americans and subsequently Asian Americans. So case law, federal policy, state law, local policy, all is rooted in grassroots and educators fighting for the very thing we're saying still is not occurring.
Right. Thank you. Christina.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I agree with much of what's been shared and did just want to lift what Dr. Thomas shared around the mindsets. So much of what allows the disparities to continue are the mindsets of what we believe is possible for our children, and how that belief plays out at the federal level, at the state level. Individuals who make decisions every day on behalf of children have to actually believe that there's better for them that were for us, even sitting in our privileged positions now. And I think until we start to have really honest conversations with each other, you can control for the knowledge that this country was built on the backs of slaves and that there was an intent desire for them never to be educated, and yet we are still here. And so if that logic holds true, what is the call to action to shift the narrative around what's possible for our children? And how do we play the role of sacrifice in making sure that we bring those things to bear? And so I think when I think about the disparities and the inequities, we have to get to a place in this country, which I would say existed at the end of slavery, during Reconstruction, where people were willing to sacrifice for another person's child. We've moved so far from caring about the children down the street or around the corner, pulling children inside their home and making sure that every child on the block did their homework, not just your child. And so I think we have to ask a set of different questions if we control for knowing that the country is going to make progress, but the country is never going to face its original sin of how this country was founded. And it was not designed for us to win, but yet we are still here.
Thank you. Ellie.
Everybody has said everything that I could come up with in my head, but I would echo what my colleague Christina Grant has mentioned about really fully understanding and spreading the knowledge of what this exactly means for our children.
Thank you. And Cameo.
Yeah, it's not a thought that I can find that everyone hasn't covered yet. But at its smallest level, I'll say the blatant disregard for the individuals who come into our schools have on the efficacy and care to progress our students' education beyond the test, beyond what it means to really be a student in this current day and age. I mean, so often we talk about, what our government is doing at different levels and what these powers that may be are doing to address the miseducation or lack thereof for our students. But what about the individuals who are local to us, who really approach our education of our students without a clear regard for the needs that directly impact them. We can talk all about education and what that means, and it's really a broad term, but when do we really get down to what are the exact needs for our students and students of color in this day and age?
Thank you. Before we go to the next question, if any of the panelists would like to answer or respond to a question that I asked, please use the raise hand symbol. And for our participants, you may ask questions using the Q&A icon or in the chat. And either Kim and I will monitor that so that we can support the panelists in their responses to your questions. Question number 2. What is your experience in acknowledging and perhaps confronting disparities or inequities in education for students of color? What are your experiences in acknowledging or perhaps confronting disparities or inequities in education for students of color? Is there anyone that would like to respond to that? I can call on you. I see raised hand, 2 participants raised hand. Who's raising? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, they're up here. Okay, Dr. Damon, and then Dr. Batista, and then Dr. King. Thank you.
So as a career and technical education administrator, I find that I, as well as my students and many other career and tech teachers, we face these disparities every day. We have to fight our own colleagues for our space and our place in this world of education because they feel as though career and technical education is not really education at all. But yet, when you think about the manner in which we can help young people fulfill their dreams and get on to college and career, it's every day that we face this. Career and tech has become a dumping ground, and quite often, and this is all across the country. This is why they changed the name back in the 80s from vocational education to career and technical education, just to give it a new look and to revamp and rebrand it. But still yet today in 2021, we're still fighting that stigma of being vocational education, and to make our young people think that if you're in a school that teaches career and tech, you're not going to college, because still you have counselors that will say that. So I think that's where we do a disservice, and you will find quite often a lot of disparities.
Thank you. Dr. Batista?
I was a child that needed to translate everything from my parents coming from school. I got a lot of homework wrong and just letters coming from school, just telling my parents what's going on in the school in English that my parents didn't know. So I was the translator. So in terms of confronting this is something that we confront on a daily basis within my office. Communications not being sent home in a language that children and parents can understand, as well as just everyday work that's being sent home as well.
Thank you. Ms. King?
So I focus on trying to be that resource for my students. When I talk about them not having those people, places, and things, If I can't be that person or get you to that place or provide you with that thing, I'm going to find someone or something that's going to be that for you. For my students that want to apply to graduate school, we're writing resumes back and forth via Zoom. For my students that are having a hard time passing the MCAT, we're looking at different study strategies. For my students that say, I've never had a Black professor, can I just come to your office hours and just ask you some questions? I have things that I wanted to know that I had no one to ask. And even though you're not my advisor, I just feel comfortable exploring these options with you. And so we have, you know, someone that's been in school for 4 years with a list of questions, but no one that they felt comfortable with talking to, and all the professors that they have encountered during this time. If I can be that resource to bridge that gap, to help us get a little bit more level playing ground, if you will, to help you be your best self, that is my goal as a professor.
Thank you. And we're going to go in order. It's Dana King,
Okay.
Dr. Adams, Al Robinson Rogers, Siobhan, and then Dr. Thomas. You had your hand raised in that order. Thank you.
Okay, I will just say that I've been an educator for more than 25 years and also practice law. But I would say in response to question 2, the highlight of my career outside of working with high school students, I'm a former history teacher, is I was the person who drafted the language for the resolution to make African American studies mandatory in the School District of Philadelphia. And I led the team of writers, which not only included academicians, but also community people and teachers. And in doing that work, we were creating space for culture. Now, the School District of Philadelphia was very innovative in being one of the first and largest districts to have what we call cultural studies programs out from the 70s, African American studies, Latino American studies, Asian American studies. That program grew out of protest from young people in '67. So when I got downtown, what we did was take it to the next level. We had already had the curriculum wars, but we were right in the smack of educational reform, curriculum reform. So in 2004, School District of Philadelphia would be the only district in the country that required African American studies as a course of study for graduation. So in the short, that is one of the ways that I confronted the inequities. It was through curriculum in the discipline of the 4 disciplines: English, history, math, and science.
Thank you.
As an educator and now an administrator at a predominantly white independent school, the way that I've acknowledged and confronted disparities and inequities for children of color, predominantly African-American students, is by creating and leading a race-based affinity group. Affinity groups are defined as a group that allows students who share the same identity, usually a marginalized identity, to gather, facilitate positive identity exploration, build connections, pose questions, talk, and process in a safe space about issues related to that identity. It also allows them to transfer their discussions into action that makes for a more equitable experience while they're at school. Affinity groups help students who share a marginalized identity to feel safe and tackle fundamental issues of injustice together. Affinity groups create safer learning environments by allowing students in the minority the confidence to be true to their identities, especially when they fear being judged by the socially accepted majority group.
Thank you. Who's next? Is it Allie or Siobhan? Which one?
No, it might be me. Siobhan gave me the nod. I think I have the pleasure of being able to serve in a position that allows me to really think critically and create strategies where in the intersection between socioeconomic status and education, right? And where students who or families that live in poverty don't have access to the same level of resources in education, and being able to try to implement and support their needs in that space to kind of break the cycle of poverty. And so the work that I do is really exciting in that I get to try to ensure that students have some type of work experience prior to entering the workforce, right? And I think the exciting part of that lends itself to where I think I experience this connection with employers, right? Is being able to push back on employers who say, well, do they have the skills? They don't have the skills. They're not ready. But employers who are not willing to even confront their own internal biases around what they think about our children when they step into the doors. Even things as simple as pushing back on employers on things related to, well, we start at 8 o'clock. So I can say, well, the daycare doesn't open until 8 o'clock. But you want to have the same time for every person that comes through the door because you have a system that encourages the inequities and disparities that we see in education. And so the way that I get to push back on that is definitely in the employer space. And I think it's something we need to pay attention to, because I think the more that we are able to increase people's ability, children and families' ability to raise out of poverty and learn and be able to advocate for resources, access resources, and be able to know where the resources are as we lift that education piece. It feeds itself. It's like a cycle that feeds itself right into the education system. So that's what I have to offer.
Thank you. Siobhan?
I think for a lot of us, education is a calling, and just our mere presence in this space before children that look like us is acknowledgement that a lot of them are situated in a system that is not controlled or fed or nurtured by their own communities per se. And I think presence is important, whether you're a classroom teacher or principal, an administrator, whatever space that you're serving in the education system is an important one for children. As a principal, my maintenance staff was all African-American men, and their capacity to connect with the boys in my building was phenomenal. Their willingness to be there every day and be consistent for those boys was acknowledgement. I think the other piece of my experience in my career around education is really the willingness to take the risk and to call out the systematic and the systemic racism that we see and how it creates these inequalities, and really surfacing this in our policies and our practices. And I think part of what has led me down the path that I have chosen is my burgeoning ability to really take a look at what policies and practices exist that maintain this level of oppression, and then making the change and being willing to question that and being willing to really have that conversation around why is this the way that we do what we do, and how is it going to affect the lives and achievement for our children. I think everybody that is not of the majority that serves in education spaces is vital and important, because that critical mass is what will eventually push that change.
Wow, thank you. So we have a couple of principals, current principals and former principals that are on the panel now. One of our participants asked, she was a previous principal in the school district of Philadelphia, and said many of the disparities are a result of people in positions granting you a yes or no with regard to your needs. Would you agree? So as a systems leader, I'm not going to answer, but as a system working in a system like the School District of Philadelphia, like Universal, like CCP, do you see a top-down approach with yes/no responses to your needs as it relates? So does the system perpetuate the disparities and inequity in education by the decisions that we make?
Sure, I could jump in on this one.
Yeah, I want to do that. You had your hand raised and I saw that
Yeah.
question.
I would say absolutely. And I mean, I definitely want to add that this experience is constant. Like there's never a break. So you're constantly fighting, you're constantly advocating, you're constantly disrupting. And just for many of us, our very own experience being in this position is confronting the disparities as we model for our students what they could be. And guess what? The fight still isn't over because I ain't make it yet, right? So it's this constant battle, it's this constant fight to examine our belief, right? Yes, I survived, but damn it, like Bettina said, I want to thrive. I want to do more than just survive. So it's definitely thinking along the vein of our beliefs and questioning central office. What do they believe? Because at some point they have to take a risk too. We take risk on the ground in our buildings each and every day, trying to connect with families, trying to connect with our students. But at some point, central office must take a risk and say, listen, this isn't right. We need to do something different. And we learn from that. So I think at the core of it, it begins with our beliefs. And I definitely agree with Siobhan. What she said about community accountability. And I think it was also Dr. Christina Grant, who also talked about community accountability. So it takes everyone to come together in this picture to actually say, hey, we got to hold one another accountable. When you give me a yes, I'm going to push back. When you give me a no, I'm going to push back. So I definitely agree that it does come from central office at times.
Thank you for your honest response. Dr. Thomas, what do you think from Community College of Philadelphia?
Yes, I'm chomping at the bit here. And I think what Siobhan and April both said, I think kind of provides a launching pad for what I wanted to say, particularly in relationship to question number 2. But it definitely all boils down to our beliefs, right? And living in America, I don't even try to acknowledge anymore. I assume, to jump in a pool and not expect to get wet, you're foolish, right? Like when you think about America and what we are and who we are and how this nation became what it is, right, to not assume that the systems that it sets up and has set up are not undergirded with racism and classism at every turn, you're foolish. And you're going to always go in banging your head up against the wall trying to figure out what's going on when it's pretty clear, right? So what I try to spend my time doing is getting other people to acknowledge what it is I know exists. And you do that by looking at data and by asking the right questions, right? So I'm looking at Dr. King on my screen, who's a therapist. So I know she knows the way to get to the core of an issue is asking the right questions and making people feel uncomfortable and then taking them back to that question in various forms so that they can potentially one day arrive at the answer that they need to arrive at, right? But then the work is on them to make the change. I'm willing to help guard you and support you to make the change, but at the end of the day, in our roles, my first and foremost calling is to make sure that my students are taken care of. So when I'm playing this game with adults, I don't acknowledge, I assume that I have to get them to either do what it is they need to do in their role or roll from their role.
Listen. Listen.
I dropped the mic for y'all.
Yes, you did. Thank you. So, Dr. Damon, you had your hand. Who had their hand raised before Christina? Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. Damon, and then Christina Grant, and then we'll go to another question.
Okay. So, of course, I experienced that, Dr. Brooks. I'll email you in a heartbeat and tell you how I really feel about things, right? But I think we have to first go in, I'll say in the school district of Philadelphia, understanding, and I believe that people have the best of intentions. The problem is that not every intention is the right one for the situation. And just, when I fight on behalf of career and technical education and the manner in which, sometimes resources are allocated, curriculum, all of the things that I do it from a place of a best intention. And when I disagree with the powers that be, I don't think in any way, shape, or form that it's a social injustice or a racial thing. I think it's an ideological difference. We see things differently. And so then I have to go back to the drawing board and try and find a way to present my case so that maybe they can see differently around career and technical education. So yes, we do have those issues where, the powers that be make decisions, but they make them based on what they know, they feel, and they believe. But I think it's not from a bad place, from my experience.
Thank you. Christina, last comment on this question?
I was just laughing at the back and forth you and I always go through in that tension that will always exist between a system and their schools. I don't think that is unique to Philadelphia. I think it's unique to the structure of how schools are structured and funded in the country that always puts us at odds between limited resources, but ridiculously high expectations for our children. And I wanted to lift up what Principal Brown said, that, part of being a Black woman in this work is the tension between thriving and surviving. And it's your natural job to disrupt. I was laughing when David spoke because I'm unapologetic about firing people who don't get things right for our children, and looking at Malika, always asking why. So like, why does it have to be that way? And why is it structured this way? And why can't I have the thing that I want? And you will earn the reputation of being the person that won't just take the decision. But I think that's part of the service we pay to be a part of this conversation and be deemed as an educator that our children should respect. And so I just wanted to lift that surviving and thriving tension that I think all of us live through. I think I walked the line just close enough to not get fired, but if it happened in service for my children, it would be worth it. And I think that's another, when we talk about mindsets, how much are we going to be willing to put on the line for our children, right, when we think about the tension between being in the system and of the system. Sorry, Dr. Brooks.
Thank you.
Oh, and I'm a proud member of the Delaware Valley chapter of the Links Incorporated. And I don't know that that's been said, but super excited to be here with you all.
Thank you, Christina. Now, I just want to clarify here, because some people made this personal with Malika. I am a systems leader, and I'm going to answer the question, respond to the question just by stating that growing up in the district, having several positions in the district, being a product of the school district of Philadelphia, and still see some of the same practices, same beliefs, and same mindsets as I saw as a student is very disturbing. And you're right, sometimes like when you're in the position, especially as an African-American female, you have to do it with courage and confidence, because I don't just represent the title, and I don't just represent my employer. I don't represent the board. I represent my community. And I'm held accountable when I walk out 440 North Broad Street. And I have to keep that in mind while my team and I are making decisions, while I'm with other chiefs making decisions, because what we do impact our future. And when we think about the Philadelphia right now, not just the school system, but Philadelphia right now, people who are in leadership positions have to take a stand, have to take a hold, because our children need us. Now, when we go to question number 3, 4, 5, and 6, a number of you have responded, and I totally appreciate it, but I do want to hear from Cameo. I want to hear from Dr. King a little bit more, although she's been participatory. I want to hear from Allie Robinson Rogers. And I said earlier, we have a lot of educators on here and we love to talk. And then when we agree, it just takes the conversation to another level. So I want to make sure that we give all of our participants an opportunity to share their thinking. And again, just raise your hand if we have about 3 or 4 people responding to a question. Is definitely.
You're on mute.
sorry. What are some, now let me go back. What are some major gaps in educational achievement between white students and students of color? And then I'm going to combine the next one. What are the perceptions of adult students, of adults? How may adult perceptions impact students of color regarding their level of success and sense of belonging in an educational entity? So one, what are those gaps? And then as adults, how do we impact those gaps? So Dr. King raised her hand. Where are you, Dr. King? I can't see you. Okay, there you go. You can begin. And I the only one, oh, and Cameo raised his hand. Thank you. You two can respond to this question.
All right. So I think one of the biggest things is that oftentimes white students get to just be students. And I am, again, I'm a college professor. So I have my Black students who work overnight, who sleep in their car to make my 8 o'clock class. I love 8 o'clock classes. To make my 8 o'clock classes, they sleep between classes to stay on campus so that they can have access to the library because they don't have a laptop, because they don't have steady internet, because they're not sure how to ask for these things. While I look at my white students who drive to campus in, you know, your BMW, your Lexus, your Range Rover, and that's just their access to resources. So I can't, and I'm going to tie in question 4 with this too. When I am looking at things like who takes attendance and who is turning their camera on and what time your papers are being submitted on Canvas, all of those things come into play. So when I'm getting an email from an advisor saying, I noticed that someone is not eligible for graduation, they're failing your class, what else can be done? They're also sleeping in their car. So we can talk about them failing my psych class. We could also talk about where can they live and how are they going to get food. And no, they don't have the textbook because again, they also don't have a place to live. Our white students get to just be students. Our brown students don't have that opportunity. And so they're starting off far below the line than their other counterparts. We talk about their ability to engage. So if I've slept in my car, if I've worked overnight, if I don't have internet, if I can't read the textbook, why would I raise my hand and participate in class? Why would I engage in the online Canvas discussion? Why would I stay after class and ask for help when I know that I haven't done all the things that I should have done and I have to really expose myself or put myself out there? Why do I really say why I'm always late to class? Why do I not want to turn my camera on? Because maybe I also have my younger siblings and or my children behind me as I'm trying to get these college courses done. There's so many things that make us always behind the ball, always limited with our ability to succeed. Our brown students are not just students.
That's so true. I think we see that in the K-12 often area too. Cameo?
Yeah, I think Dr. King kind of hit it on the head when we talk about, you know, where do we start and where does it end in terms of, you know, these disparities that our students face, especially when we're talking about resources and lack thereof. When we talk about the lack of funding from K through 12 all the way through college and beyond. You know, when we talk about the redlining and education that we see. Just at the K through 12 stage, and then you know just the lack of education around financial aid, financial assistance that we see for our students in higher ed is abysmal. You know, and our students, as Dr. King said, they're facing all of these things on top of the implicit bias that they face from you know faculty that may be in the classroom. You know, and one of the biggest things that I always find, and it's really not a technical thing, but for many of our students, when you look at the white institutions or predominantly white institutions, it's usually more of a why not. When it comes to our students' experience, it's a why. Can you prove that what you want to do or that what you're fighting for makes sense? Does that leadership conference, why does that fit our budget? What is the purpose of this? When you ask for more materials as a staff member, as a faculty member, how can we quantify or qualify this to make sense for your operation? For our predominantly white institutions, for white students, it's like, okay, what else can we get them? And it's not really a matter of why not, but it's the understanding that they need that resource. And for us, it's always about what resource can we fight for on a particular day or at a particular time, because we see it's a revolving door when we talk about the issues that face our students of color. Especially when we talk about just being able to show up. As mentioned, that resource around personnel. I mean, at this point, when you walk into a school, when you walk onto a higher ed campus, and you're like, what resources do our students have when it comes to mental health? What resources do they have when it comes to their affinity groups or their spaces for belonging? And you may be able to point to one person there, one person there, somebody who's probably doing multiple jobs to help a student, whether they're overseeing Greek life, student leadership, and teaching some courses, and those folks are tired. But when we talk about the resources for our white students, they have someone who, or multiple persons who can walk them throughout that process, and that starts at a very young age. So by the time they're reaching their adult age and they can question, a lot of students have already lost trust in the system, and now we're trying to rework their mentality even behind the education system and what that means. I mean, so often do we come across students who are debating, is higher education for me, or what am I really spending my time and dollars on? So when they come into the classroom and we're having to work with them and say, hey, you belong, you make sense in being here. This campus, this person in front of you is for you. And we have to work around that. So as Dr. King already mentioned, just the ability to be a student is something that is almost, secondhand. We have to actually help them feel fulfilled as a human being, as a person who is stepping into our office, who is spending their time with us, and who is committing to our institution. So when we, at the end of the day, which is limited, we have 24 hours in a day. And when we talk about how many students come on our campus with the same issues of feeling devalued, I mean, it becomes a headache at some point, to where we have to understand that student, that we help the one day is going to be another one of those students walking in the next day who's facing the same issues. So we become taxed as professionals, and our white students aren't dealing with that. They already have some systems set in place. And once again, just the ability to be able to turn on the TV and see someone that looks like them already instills something that we have to unpack on a daily basis, just to help our students be comfortable with being in that in that institution, or feeding into what we say is the promise for better education.
Thank you. Dr. Adams, and then Dana King, and then we will move to the next question.
I believe there are major gaps in our educational achievement between white students and students of color, because we are comparing students who are living in poverty to students who are living in wealth. We're comparing students from families with limited educational resources to families with advanced degrees. So we're not comparing them equally. I'd also like to look at the behavior system that's in place, especially when it comes to our children of color. Our Black and Brown students are suspended twice as often as our white students. They're expelled from school 4 times as often as our white students. I have a colleague at Germantown Friends School, Andre Lee, who just finished a documentary called Virtually Free, and it explores the juvenile justice system in Richmond, Virginia. And in this documentary, he explores how this community is trying to stop the juvenile justice system, which is a pipeline to the penal system. And so they're incarcerating our Black children at enormous rates. So I also want to suggest that our words matter. When we think in terms of achievement, we're looking at systems, we're emphasizing systems. But when we think in terms of opportunities, we highlight causes such as health, such as housing, nutrition, safety, and enriching experiences. And I believe all of these symptoms must improve before we can expect any achievement gap to close.
Thank you. Dana?
I think it's important to also understand the history behind systems such as a large school district like the School District of Philadelphia. Historically, the district had two systems. You had your magnet system and you had your comprehensive system, which we consider to be your neighborhood school system. So when you have Black and brown families having access to the magnet system always depended upon whether or not they had members in their families who were educators who knew the route to get into the magnet system. Oftentimes our children or our families found themselves recycling the poor educational experiences they had in some of our schools that weren't functioning. I know we'll get to the charter system later on, but I do want to say that the greatest threat to the dignity to Black and brown children is people's perceptions of their ability, their intellectual ability. And so that's the kind of gap, as Dr. Adams just spoke about, is before we even get to understanding how the academic achievement gap is addressed, what happens first is people's perceptions about the intellectual ability of our children. And one of the things, and I'm hoping that we'll get to, when we get to the solution, we'll talk about the categories. There is a class, we have racialized poverty feeding that gap. We have the categories of Black and not differentiating between our children that are coming from Haiti, Jamaica, or continental Africa, or the continual European immigrant children like the Russian and Ukrainian children who come in already with a great educational background before they get here, but they're included in the white category, the Asian category, and the Latino category, which generalizes 4 or 5 different subsets of groups. So as African American or Black and brown educators, we have a responsibility to begin to readdress how that achievement gap is defined.
Thank you. So the next question, and Dana, you're kind of, I was going to skip it, but you started talking and it made me think that I should just go ahead and ask it. About 3 responses. What have you noticed? What have you noticed in the generational impact of disparities and inequity in the educational systems? And here we have private school, we have the charter schools represented, and we have district schools represented, and we have higher ed represented here. What have been some of those generational, what has been the generational impact of disparities in education that you notice in your current role? I was gonna say, I just need one hand. I asked for 3. Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
I got you, sure. I think every question that we've answered up to this point has kind of addressed it. So one of the things, again, Dr. King mentioned Since she's in higher ed, I'm gonna use her as a point of reference. But I was also in K-12 at one point, so it lives with me. For us to expect that the same challenges that impacted our students through the K-12 system suddenly go away that summer after they graduated from high school and enrolled in higher ed is ridiculous. And that seems to be what we think, right? So those disparities, those inequities that are, mind you, 400 years in the making, right? Like, let's be honest. So Attorney King just talked about like the systems that exist, and what I think undergirds the achievement gap is the opportunity gap and the resource gap and the expectation gap and all those things that go back to 1619 up until this point. We feel as though because, you know, the Civil Rights Act was ratified in 1965 that everything is kumbaya, right? Like, that's not what happens. Those systems very often that perpetuated those inequities and those inequalities became further ingrained into what it is we call America, and then makes it more difficult for you to kind of call it out, right? We no longer see colored restroom signs and white restroom signs, and colored water fountain signs and white water fountain signs, but we see the disparities in the fact that you get students who graduate from the same high school, but sometimes those students that are Black come to CCP, they take the our AccuPlace or placement test, and they place at developmental levels, but the white kid places at Calc 2 and, you know, the higher level of English, and you wonder what happened here. You know, weren't y'all in the same school? Very often has nothing to do with what happened in that school, but it's everything that happened prior to that, right? And everything that exists in our system and in our society that perpetuates and further exacerbates these disparities. So very often for me at the college, I have conversations with, you know, the folks that are servicing our students, not just in student service area, but also in the academic space and with faculty who talk about what's going on with the students that we get from the district. I'm like, nothing's going on with them outside of the fact that we as a society have failed them and their families for generation upon generation, right? And now it's our chance and it's our opportunity to address that. In community colleges, you know, we're open access, we're open enrollment. So, you know, I tell my faculty, I don't know why you're complaining about a student not being able to do what it is you expect. This is community college. You knew what you were signing up for when you came here. We open access, open enrollment. If you're not girded up enough with the skills and competencies that you need to get that student where they need to be, you probably need to work somewhere else. It's the bottom line. Like, that's the type of institution we have. But even when I was in K-12, you know, my high school teachers would complain about what the middle school didn't do to prepare. And the middle school complained about what the elementary school didn't do to prepare, right? Elementary school complained about what Head Start didn't do to prepare. Then Head Start complained about what the mom did. The mom said, that's from the dad side of the family. That ain't my side. So everybody always blame shifting, right? The reality is it rests with somebody. And when they show up in your classroom, in your office, it's your job to address that issue, regardless of what happened before that. So we have a huge, I think, issue that we have to address, particularly in the educational space, if we're going to move the needle at all. And we have to do it one student at a time, as well as moving the systems.
Thank you. Ali, you changed your mind? Do you want to?
No, I don't know if I changed my mind. I think the thing that I wanted to say, Dave stole my answer, right? Because that's what he does. But I think the thing that really resonated with me and what I was thinking about was kind of like that we've failed them and their families for so long, right? And so when they come to us needing whatever it is that they need from us, if we're not able to meet that kind of head on, then we're continuing to do them a disservice, right? And so I think I put my head back down because Dave went into it deep, but that was the thing that really we have been failing them and their families, and I would just add for so very long.
Right. All right, thank you. So there, April, Zara, and Siobhan, have your hands raised, and I'm going to say, can you limit your responses to less than 1 minute so that we can get to the solution-oriented part of this symposium? And that's
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Dave also stole my answer. So thank you for that, Dave. But I just wanted to put emphasis on the fact that our families are not just in poverty, but they're in deep poverty. And it starts in the womb. And many times it starts even before the conception. So definitely trying to figure out ways to engage. And I'm on the opposite side of Dave because I'm in a K-8 and I see our kindergartners who come to us who have been underserved, who have been neglected, where families feel abandoned, and just trying to re-engage preschools, trying to re-engage daycares and families. I have found that to be a struggle for us. But it's definitely something that's on my mind, how to engage those families who are in deep poverty, who lack trust. Because for many of them, the school building is the enemy because of their experiences. So my commitment to them, and I try to share my story with them, is that I try to make your child's experience better than mine because I was harmed. And I am also a product of the School District of Philadelphia, from Spring Garden Elementary to Starter Flasher Middle School to Bodine High School. And I didn't get what I needed. And when I went to college, it was very clear that I did not get what I needed. So I try to share that story with families and use that as a starting point to let them know that I am someone that they can trust. I may not have the right answers all the time. I may not have the answer that they want all the time, but I'm definitely advocating and fighting for those families. So I definitely agree with what Dave and Ali said.
Thank you. Dr. Adams?
Speaking from the perspective of an educator now, administrator at a predominantly white independent school, especially one that was created in the 1800s for all white people. You know, what happens when students of color enter our campus is that they realize that this is a school system that was not created for them. So we're now involved in a system that is slowly evolving to make, you know, that student and those families feel comfortable, whereas the white student comes to campus as a third, fourth generation you know, student at that school. They come with a level of comfort. They come with a familiarity of the campus, you know, attending, you know, different events and activities, you know, coming with their families, you know, for generations. They come knowing the teachers and the administrators already. So there's already a sense of ease when white students enter our campus as opposed to, you know, the students of color. Then there's, you know, the piece that we don't see, you know, the outside pieces that are afforded by that wealth. The tutors that happen outside of school that people don't talk about. Not just test prep, but just regular tutors, you know, for English, math, you know, the foreign languages. The experiences, not just going to plays, but traveling around the world to, you know, to see things in person that many of us just read about in books. So those are the disparities that our children of color face when they attend predominantly white independent schools.
Thank you. And Siobhan, the last response for this question.
I always think of the fact that we acknowledge that these disparities are created across generations, and we don't often talk about the generational impact that these disparities have, right? Because mom went to my school when she was younger. Now I have mom's kindergartner, and her experience in the school didn't benefit her to the way that she would have a trusting relationship with the school. How do I remediate that? And then looking at the actual impact of the educational disparity that she experienced, how do we now wrap her family so that we can begin to remediate some of that harm? And what we need to do as a system, and not just in the education system, but just looking at all of the different resources and possibilities that we have across the city, is what is it that we have available for mom? Can I call Dr. Thomas and say, hey, mom wants to come to CCP so that she can better her educational experience and get an associate's degree and better her living experience because right now she's homeless? Can I call IBHS services and get this child some therapy resources because he's been living in a homeless shelter for the past 6 months? Can I call the daycare down the street and say, hey, this baby right here needs some additional support and help. I know y'all got it going on because you teach phonics. I'm gonna send him down there. You got a discount for me. I got some vouchers. What does that look like? How do we actually support the whole unit? Because when we start doing that, then we start actually reducing some of that generational impact and harm to the point where we make a healthier family that can move forward. And that family unit can be set up however they want it to be. But the point is to begin to give them some of those resources and opportunities that they weren't afforded because the education system didn't give them access to it based upon opportunity.
Thank you. So your response actually is going to lead us into the solution-oriented portion of the symposium. One of our participants asked in the Q&A that we refer to, she said that we refer to the early childhood population. And I know in the School District of Philadelphia, we have a pre-K through 12 program, and we offer pre-kindergarten and Head Start to our students. Specifically, a lot of our low-income students are in the Head Start program. So when we think about, someone just said from preconception, like I think it was April, so she wants us to think through not just the K through higher ed, but as we respond to think through pre-K at the same, early childhood at the same time. Thank you for that request. So now we have identified what disparities and inequity mean to the panelists. We have shared some of our experiences. We've shared how we got to this place. We've shared why we are in this place. We shared the impact of disparities and inequities in education on our society. Now, I want us to think through, we have 4 more questions for discussion. It is now 7:10. Think through some solution and have a deep conversation, and you can reply to each other. This is the discussion portion, just as long as we're not talking over each other. So the first question is, what are some questions that your educational entity need to ask to address equity in your educational system? Which means we should have a response from everyone that is represented here. What is it that you would like your educational entity to ask as they think through equity, which means we're eradicating disparities and inequity in our system? So I don't see any, 2 participants raise hands, Dr. Damon and Ms. Brown, and then everyone can respond. Just raise your hand and not talk over each other. If it gets a little chaotic, then I will call on people. But I really want us to have a discussion here because this is where we learn from each other. Think about our individual systems as they relate to the bigger educational system, as it relates to several other systems that I think someone just discussed that impact families and students. Starting with Dr. Damon, and then April, and then I'll call it Damon, Brown, Adams, Pritchett, and then everyone else can join the discussion.
So first off, I want to thank Dr. King for what she acknowledged is that our Black and Brown children just don't get to be children anymore. And we need to recognize that when we're talking about achievement and when we look at what achievement is. Dave said also, you can't also look at what's going on in the school building. And so when you start to look at that, we maybe need to ask ourselves a couple of questions. One, now, what really is achievement? Is achievement solely how we score on a standardized test? I mean, I say that maybe it's not, because when you have many of the children, and I'll say the children that I serve, not scoring well on the test, I don't think it's because they can't read. But yet people tell me all the time, Dr. Damon, the data says your children cannot read on grade level. No, what the data says is they are not demonstrating their abilities to read and succeed on the standardized test. I have some very, very talented young people. I mean, when you see what they can do in and around the salon, in the kitchen, in the science lab, when we're talking about biotechnology, in the music lab, in the recording studio, these students are very talented and they can be put up against many of the professionals. We have students who get ServSafe certification. When you walk in any restaurant, it's usually only the manager that has that certification. So I think if we want to do anything, we need to ask ourselves, one, what is achievement? Is it really just how our students perform on the standardized test? But then I say, what do our children really need to succeed? We're talking about surviving and thriving. What do they need? And it's not looking at a school and ranking and filing schools and making decisions because your school is not meeting this score or doing what less than half of the students across the state are doing. But maybe we need to see, because see, I have a good number of special ed students and I love them because guess what? They bring something new to the table. They make me think differently of how I educate students. I have poor students. I have hungry students. I have unhappy students. And we have to think of how to even educate them in these times and make them understand that what they need and what they have to do is relevant for their success, but not only their success, their entire community. In these times, I'm teaching my children not just to be scientists, to be cosmetologists, but to be scientists of color that serve the Black community and lift other people up. For us, that's what it means to be a community school and to give back to the community. So I think we just really need to ask ourselves, what does success really look like for our children?
And along the same vein as Dr. Damon, I jotted down a couple of questions. What do we really believe? Like, what is our belief system? And based on our belief system, how do we coach up and or coach staff out who are not willing to acknowledge that there are inequities in our systems, and those who are not able to grasp the emotional intelligence to be able to do this work efficiently and effectively. So what are the next steps? And getting that basic understanding that our belief systems really impact what we think and what we say. And then those systems impact our actions. And then before you know it, we're normalizing, we have habits. So I really think we have to ask that question of each individual. What do you believe? And keep pressing them until they get to the core of what they believe.
Definitely. That belief feeling is essential. I mean, it goes back to the integrity of the leadership, integrity of the institution. One big question that just is constantly burning in my mind, whether it's, talking about these institutions, and one that our, society is asking right now is the response to the recent uprisings due to police brutality, COVID, and everything that we're seeing take place in front of our very eyes. Is it a moment, or is it a moment, or is it truly going to be a movement to change? And I say that, in regards to higher education or any educational institution, is because we're seeing a lot of response right now. Okay, we can put out this, diversity seminar, or we can put out, this, grouping of words that sounds good, and all of that good stuff, to make the student or make anyone walking through our doors feel comfortable when they look at the wall or look at our Instagram or whatever it is that they're posting this on. But is this really sustainable? Are institutions really going to go further and go beyond just the words that they're putting out there? Are they really going to follow through on their asking these questions? Are they really going to follow through on their promises to meet the students' needs as we are asking? The other one I would say is really for a lot of institutions, especially those that recruit, and once again, speaking of higher education, really asking themselves when they're offering our students opportunity, are they really offering for the sake of a quota, or are they offering because they truly believe that a student of color, a Black student, Latino student, or whoever that they're recruiting can truly thrive on their campus. Because I see, a lot of these colleges are becoming used car salesmen. Yes, it sounds good to say we offer this, we offer that for your educational experience, but do you truly believe that you have the dollars to help the student cover the tuition? And are you willing to make it happen for those students who don't? Do you really have the adequate housing for these students? Do you really have the support systems in place for when these students get to campus and they're pressuring you because they see that the Black Student Union isn't getting as much funding as, the gaming club? Are you willing to step up to the plate when you're offering these students this so-called opportunity? And when they feel that you aren't, are you willing to make the adjustment? So asking those questions and going back to what Ms. Brown said, are you willing to go the extra mile for those students by asking your staff or your leadership? Are you willing to develop yourselves in a way that's going to allow you to even interact in a way that students feel comfortable? Once again, going back to the integrity of the entire situation. Yes, we know all of these, factors exist, but what do you truly believe?
Thank you, Cameo. Before Dr. Adams give her response, there are 2 questions in the Q&A that I'm going to ask the panelists to type a response to based on your profession and your background. You may have some expertise for both of those questions because they're very specific. One deals with undergraduate teacher education programs, and the other one is isn't recommendation for parents dealing with addressing microaggressions toward Black and Brown children from their teacher and administrator. Okay, and so Q&A. If you want, all you have to do is just type an answer there so that the participants may receive a response from you, Dr. Adams, and then Allie Robinson Rogers, Dr. King, and Dr. Thomas.
I think my educational institution needs to ask or answer 2 questions. One is how to support students of color at an educational institution that was not created for them. And the second question is how to dismantle the systemic racism that exists in the fabric of a school that was established in the 1800s. This summer, during the racial uprisings after the death of George Floyd, students at predominantly white schools spoke out about the injustices at their schools using the Black At campaign on Instagram. So they not only spoke about the treatment that they face, but also how ill-equipped their educators are at that school. I think what needs to happen is, many institutions have, taken an inward look, because it was so vocal. And they've decided to regroup and make some changes, but wondering, are they going to be long lasting, or is this just in the short term, just while we're still remembering, the effects of what happened in the summertime? The changes are ultimately for the health of the whole community. But at our school, we've been working on anti-bias training, and this is for students, parents, faculty, and administrators. And I think the real shift in this is including the parents. So much of what goes on at school is just about the students and the faculty, and we often leave out the family. The partnership is the home and the school and the community. We all have to be in a partnership for things to work effectively. So I'm glad to see, things were moving in that direction, but also starting at the top with training. The administrators have to be on board and send a clear message that trickles down through the school community. So again, I think our 2 questions are how to support students of color at an institution that was not created for them, and how to dismantle the systemic racism that's in the fabric of the school.
I think I want to maybe drill down into what Principal Brown was talking about. I think it's been really apparent for me in being open and honest and transparent in this space that I am annoyed by, and maybe that's work I need to do. I hope you all support me in that. But I am annoyed with people's maybe it's the trying to create the perception that they are culturally proficient when they're not. And so when we're in these spaces and you trying to be, look, can I be real with y'all? And you trying to be woke, but you're using microaggressions in your speech and in the context of the conversations that were happening, it is apparent to me that you may not be where you are. And so I try to be as vulnerable I can in spaces like that and show that I'm not where I want to be, right? But I think if we don't, to Principal Brown's point, if we don't drill down into that, what do you believe? I think the question that I posed in my head was why? Like, do you know your why, and what do you and that it's tied to the what do you believe? Because if we are not able to address those questions to ourselves and figure out what we need to do, and all of the other adults in our spaces, which include parents, family, staff, teachers, all of these people, if we don't do that work first, I think we're always going to be kind of chipping away at something, but not actually getting to the finish line of where we really would hope to be. So just kind of wanted to add that.
Was I next?
It was Dr. King and then you.
Okay.
Sorry. Dr. Rogers took me somewhere else. I was getting ready to I was getting ready to go there with her, but let me stick to what I was originally going to say. And I'm going to put my therapist hat on for a moment. So in my other life, I administer psychological evaluations, usually for trauma, any type of sexual abuse, physical abuse, exposure to violence, witnessing a murder, et cetera, et cetera. Whether it's working with the court system and sometimes referrals from the school systems. And so, how often do I have brown children, usually my little brown boys in front of me, that have been kicked out of school for X amount of times? And now, Dr. King, can you put on this letter that nothing is wrong with me, that I can go back to school? And so my question, and this speaks to education at large, is how do we truly say that we understand and embrace mental health when we in turn sometimes abuse it as a behavioral disciplinary system, right? How often do I have my college students who, on top of all the other stuff, remember, they can't just be a student, they also just need to work on this trauma that's been happening, and maybe even generational trauma that's been happening, but there's no space in place to safely discuss mental health. We already know that mental health is not accepted in our particularly Black community. We already know that. So if our Black students don't feel safe discussing it at home, and then perhaps at school, I'm now being deemed or labeled as something is wrong with me behaviorally, and no one is meeting me where I need to be emotionally, how can I ever be successful academically? And so truly, my question remains, how can we use our systems to work together and best represent each other, taking responsibility for that, not just saying something's wrong with you, come back when you have a letter that says that you're okay. I can't tell you how often parents are disappointed that I am not going to write a letter that says that, because there's no such thing that says you're okay. But this is the message that our children are walking around with, and our parents are walking around with. There's something wrong with my child. There's something wrong with me. So how am I ever going to be successful at passing elementary school or middle school or high school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if I have now been labeled as something is wrong with me within the system. And so what I feel like what happens, unfortunately, is that the system, all of it, education, legal, mental health, now we are all, quote, quote, the bad guys, if you will, for those parents and those children. And so it creates an even higher barrier for us to reach these children and families, for them to be successful, for them to advance in whatever capacity that they would like to.
So before I talk about the two questions that our institution needs to ask and answer, I want to address the term microaggressions. So for me, you'll probably never hear me utilize that term. And even though I understand what it means and how it came about, to me, it sounds like a perpetrator of that aggression trying to minimize what it is they did, right? Like very often the recipient of that aggression may not have all classified it as micro. And I think we've seen over time how those very often covert yet intentional microaggressions lead to some of the very things that Dr. King just mentioned, right? Putting students into a system and therefore railroading their entire future. So those microaggressions compounded over time, over and over again, that very often are not things that are unconscious. Very often they're very conscious and yet very covert and intentional. And to me, that's sadistic. So I would never call that micro. I describe that as an aggression. I might even describe it more macro than anything else, because you really thought about that and tried to do it in a different way. But I'm gonna get off that horse right now. And I wanna talk about more specifically the two questions that our institution, Community College of Philadelphia, needs to ask. And I always try to start with our institution asking the why questions first, right? So you look at the data, because why is gonna require you to go internal and come up with an answer, right? That's gonna require you to not only wrestle with the data, but wrestle with your heart, your motives, how you respond to it, and really contemplate and think about that. One of the why questions that we've been asking ourselves as an institution for quite some time now is why do 75% of our students represent as Black and brown, is 75% of our faculty and administration, predominantly faculty, represent as 75% white, right? So there's this huge disparity. The faculty don't look like the students don't look like the faculty, right? Why is that? And I think there are lots of answers, and we are beginning to wrestle with those answers, and not only wrestle with the answers, but know what the answers are, and hopefully to address the disparities that come as a result of that reality. I think the other wide question that we are asking ourselves, and we've been asking ourselves, is why do, at the start of a cohort, of a class of students that enters the institution, why are 70 to 80% of those students of color? But by the time that same cohort gets to graduation, only 40% of them are of color, right? The students that are white and Asian can really go successfully from start to finish, but the students that are Black and Latino drop off for whatever reason. Why is that? Why are our retention numbers tilting by the time those same students that start in the same cohort not lasting? The graduating class should look like the incoming class by and large. Those are the questions that we have to wrestle with, because to me, it gets to the core of what we're doing as an institution to support all students from start to finish successfully.
Me, Dana. Okay, so as a person, first of all, let me congratulate the links, because this is probably the first time that I've seen a panel this diverse in terms of representation by institutions. So we've had panels going back 10, 15, 20 years on inequity, and it normally was just the school district of Philadelphia. So this particular setting has allowed us to see that our children need us no matter what institution they're in. So I'm representing the charter school system. And even though if you read the news, you would think that we are at we're an adversary to the school district of Philadelphia. It doesn't make sense. We service the same families. Our families run in and out of the districts into charters. But for Universal, what makes us unique, and I will say to you all, I worked for the district for nearly 20 years, and I was that person inside that helped the retired educators in communities, both for Black and brown children, to have those options in different parts of the cities as charter. My name is on nearly almost all of those early applications. So I will say to you, for Universal, it's unique because it was founded as an education management organization, which means that we oversee more than one charter. We're a part of the Renaissance system. So our questions that we pose are rooted in this belief that we can educate our own children. That is a very important question, because there are people that don't believe that Black and brown people can educate their own children. So when you talk about the 75%, that ain't just at community college, that's in almost any institution that serve Black people. Because if they don't, but people come to the system not believing in Black leadership, that you're not capable of changing the system to work on behalf of Black and brown children. And I must add, whatever we do well for Black and brown children is good for all children. So the question we ask is whether or not we still come with the same energy we have when we start those applications to say that we can do what a school district as large as the district could not do for our families. Do we still maintain that belief, and how are we executing it? 2, how do we redefine what is commonly called the academic achievement gap, which we've redefined it. We look at the gap that we must address that exists between a child's potential and their achievement, meaning we know how our children come in. They have the potential. What must we do to get them to what we define as achievement? Now, how does that differ from some other systems that are not necessarily culturally relevant or community-based models? The one thing that Universal does differently is that it's a community-based model. So we have family resource centers so that we're not just trying to educate our children, we are also educating their families. Additionally, the other thing that we are working on to do, and this comes from understanding the history of Black institutions. The historical Black colleges and universities are long-standing, and they have produced some of the greatest minds that are leading some of the greatest institutions. And so we have to begin to look at what has happened, what has done that was successful. For example, in literacy, if you look at the history of African people, enslaved Africans coming out of enslavement, going into those same free schools, what we call freedom schools, going into what we now call HBCUs, illiteracy in the Black community right after the enslavement period decreased by 65% without all of the materials and millions of dollars that we spend. So the questions that we ask as an institution, a small institution, is 1, can we still carry on that energy and the belief that we can do this? 2, how do we implement and execute the way that we have defined the academic achievement gap? And 3, what expectations do we have of ourselves that allow us to continue this work and train our replacements? So 50 years from now, we're not still having this discourse.
Thank you. Christina, last comment.
Yes, this is super quick, but I did want to uplift what Siobhan said. I think one of the biggest questions we have to ask is how do we right size the relationships we have with our families that we didn't serve well when they attended the schools, regardless of the space? Because I think that's a through line between all of our sectors, independent, public, charter. That if the parents didn't have a positive experience with education, if the parents didn't achieve the dream that we say, or the promises that are to be achieved by getting access to a quality education, how do we start that conversation? And I think, as Siobhan, it resonated with me so much, because we often will find ourselves with a student in high school and their mom is attending school with us at night, or we're figuring out how to make sure that, you know, a family member can re-engage with the education system and have a positive experience that second time. And I do think that, at least when I was a principal, it would be like, well, what are the dreams you have for your child, and what are the dreams you have for yourself? And what role can we play in restoring dreams of a family? Because we, at least in this sacred space, still do believe in the power of education. And then I think the work of equity is in the fabric of the system that you operate in. And so, are you looking at hiring practices? Are you looking beyond where someone went to school to really dig deep? I don't know if it was Principal Brown, but someone spoke about the core values and doing the work of being woke. So have you read the literature? Can you actually speak to a microaggression from the stance of having been a part of one, or having participated in putting a microaggression on someone else in your day-to-day activity? I think there's a different conversation that we should have around equity that has to do with the people who have the privilege of being in and a part of our system, from the janitors all the way to individuals who make policy level decisions, both within the system and surrounding the system. I think some of the challenges we face are, I always say, it's baked in the carpet. And I think we have to think about buying new carpet, throwing out the carpet, recreating why we even have carpet in the first place. But I think that's the harder system level work, that's the long haul game of, I think Dr. King said it, of ensuring that we won't be here 50 years from now having the same conversation.
Yeah, and thank you all for that response. I'm not on the panel, I'm the facilitator. However, in thinking about in the educational entity that I am in which I am employed, we have focused on, as a leadership team, Christina help me out, I think this is like year 3, we focused on equity, defining equity. And now the district has an equity coalition that is doing a lot of work. In addition to that, we focus a lot on identifying anti-racist behavior and white supremacy culture in the district. As a leader in the district, and my team, some of my team members are here. We had a conversation, because I take it from the district level and focus on our work and how does it show up in our work, right? We have a lot, and Ali said, we have a lot of my team, there's not one member on my team who's going to come out and say, no, I'm a racist, right? And then we have members on our team who believe that they are woke. And we have members on our team who are like, wait, this is making me uncomfortable, right? So we have a continuum of people as they go through the process of awakening their own biases and prejudice, and supporting biases and prejudice as it relates to the work that they're doing in addition to their personal lives. And I asked the team a week or 2 ago, like, it's easy to say, yes, I'm anti-racist. I'm anti-racist. I'm down with white supremacy culture until it impacts you, right? And that's where I am. And that's what we call out. I'm good with it until you walk into my department and tell me to do things differently, because now I said I was there as long as it's over here. When I have to do something different, that's when you see where people really are. And I'm charging us here, because I saw one of the comments there. When we see that, that's when you call it out, not to beat the person down, but let me take you where you need to be. I'm glad you're uncomfortable right now. I'm gonna hold you accountable for my expectations, but I'm also gonna pull you along, because it's not just about you, because you're impacting a whole department, a lot of adults that's gonna impact a lot of children. And that is the work. So the question I kind of asked my department, my office, and a district, I understand where we're going, but how far are you willing to go? Because you're gonna make some people uncomfortable. You're gonna develop some enemies that's gonna smile in your face and say she has to go. Been there, right? I think a couple of us have been in that place. But you have to be willing to, and I stand on principle. and practice and not friendships, right? And I always say, wherever you are, all you're taking with you is your reputation. And if you buckle when you're supposed to stand strong, everybody's going to see that you buckle, and you can't come away from that. Okay, so that was my piece. Now, the next two questions, and it is 7:40. What I want to do is I'm going to combine the last two questions and then give each panelist a minute for their last thoughts. So the last question is about systems, not just the educational system, but other systems that exist that can help us eradicate these disparities and inequities in the educational system. So I'm going to combine them, but I'm going to combine both questions. I'm going to state both questions, but your response can be combined. If you had a collective system to eradicate the lack of opportunities for children of color, what are 1 or 2 strategies that you would implement? And then the last question was, do we have systems that help us connect and act on inequities and disparities? So what are those 1 or 2 strategies that you would implement if we had a system? And then the other question is, do we need to develop that system, or does the system exist and we just don't use it?
Dr. Brooks, I think there's so many systems in place that are out of our reach, right? So when I think about the systems in terms of equalizing and sharing the resource across the board, right? Why did the North Penn students in my school district get more funding, right? And we're talking about like funding with the housing and stuff like that. So there's so many systems that are just not reachable at this point, right? That it takes more than just us, right? In terms of that, what was the second question?
What I hear you're saying is that, so you answered the second part. No, those systems doesn't exist in every environment. But if you had that system, what are 1 or 2 strategies that you would implement? So this is question, I think, is 11 and 10.
Getting to on the 11 question, I put, I was thinking about getting to that root cause. And I think a lot of folks have mentioned getting to the why, right? Continue to ask the why until we get to that root cause.
Thank you. Anyone else? This is the time to say, if in my perfect world, like we just called out all the problems, we just called out what everybody else needs to do. If in my perfect world, if I had this, I know we can accomplish this. What would it be? And I see hands. Thank you. We're going to go to Dr. King. You guys just move. You're going to go to Dr. King, Dr. Damon, Dr. Adams, Dr. Thomas, and Ms. King. And then let's do those now because you all just moved on the screen with me.
So I am going to continue with the thought that we have too many systems. We have too many systems. Too many systems, goals that do not overlap, but we're talking about one singular child or family, right? So for the child that is in middle school that somehow got put out of school, so now he must go have an evaluation. Now he's in the mental health system. And because of this being kicked out, then there's also a social worker becoming involved with child services. And now he's in the child welfare system. And so guess what? He's missed X amount of days because this mental health thing is taking too long. Now he's in the legal system, right? And so I have the mom who can take off just 1 day of work, right? Just 1 day of work. So which day does she take off? Does she go with her child to court? Does she show up for the mental health evaluation? Does she speak to the social worker over the phone? Does she come to after school to meet the teacher? And each system has an expectation for this one parent and for this one child, and they're not overlapping. And so if I could wave my magic wand, our one system needs to have the same ending goal, because as it stands right now, we are setting up any person in any system to fail. We have to have the same goal.
Thank you. Dr. Damon, were you next?
I think so. And I agree with that. We have so many systems and so many things going on and so many silos. when you talk about in a perfect world, I would just kind of make things a little more simpler and just say if we could just meet the kids and the families where they are and give them the support that they need, however it is, just plain and simple. That's really where I would sit it. I don't want to go on and on, but I look at me in April. We're boots on the ground. You know, we have systems in place, but quite often what we do is when a child needs something or a family needs something, we just go out there and get it. And if we don't have it, we just reach out to whoever. Hey, look, can you help me out? That's why we know a lot of you folks, because we reach out to you. Hey, do you know this or do you have that? How can we get some of that? That's what I just like to see if we could just break down some of these systems.
Thank you. And Dr. Adams?
I agree with Dr. Damon. I think, especially coming from a predominantly white independent school, the financial structure is what impedes so many actions from going in the right direction. Because our school is an educational institution, but it's also a business that's supported by tuition and the generosity of donors. So, the school's often trying to appease those that can keep the business afloat without just thinking simply what's in the best interest of the students, what's in the best interest of the families. So just keeping things simple, if we could somehow wave our magic wands and restructure the financial system, I think we could think in terms of what's in the best interest of students and families.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
Yes, so I just want to underscore one thing and then I'm going to answer my question. Dr. King, we have way too many systems. I concur, way too many. But the question calls us to think about a perfect world, right? What would we do in a perfect world? And I have to cement this in I have a bachelor's degree in theology, so very often I will refer to things in the Judeo-Christian scriptures or the Hebrew or Islamic faith to make a point. And in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, I believe in the book of 1 Samuel, there was a story around a prophet who came to knight the next king of Israel. And he went to a man who had many sons and said that God said, one of your sons is going to be the next king. And that man went and brought in all of his sons except his youngest one. His youngest son was a shepherd who stayed and tended the sheep. And when all the other sons came in, and the prophet was like, nope, it's not this. They was like, well, who could it be? He said, you got to have another son. He said, because I know God didn't send me to the wrong home. And they said, well, I had my son, his name was actually David. I had my son David, but he's a shepherd. He's the baby. He can't be him. He said, well, bring him to me. And when he brought him to him, the prophet says, this is the one, right? And all of his brothers, and even if they couldn't believe it, like, how can that be the case? The prophet said, man looks on the outward, God sees the heart. And if I could create a system, it would be a system where we could not see the outward, but all we could do was judge people based off of the intent and the character of their heart. Because it's inherent in the question that we ask around the disparities and inequities that exist for students of color, right? Color is something we see. But if we literally could not see the external, the things that I think have created so many chasms and schisms in humanity, and all we could see were people's hearts, I think that would be the starting point for us to really be able to eradicate these issues that impact us as a human society.
Thank you so much. And now, Dana King, and then people have their hands raised. Dana King, Siobhan, Cameo, April.
Okay, so I will conclude with, we live in a capitalistic society, which the model of capitalism sort of infers that you are supposed to have a poverty class. We disagree. However, even with all of the many systems, we have to remember that each of the systems of which we're speaking about were created by white male capitalists who were blessed by bigotry and riddled with racism. So we are here speaking about how do we change a system that continues to run from its inception the way it's been running. So really the only system we need to change first is the one that we control, because that is the system that gives birth to all of the people that become the people that either go against the other systems or become a part of the systems. So I will conclude with a quote by Robin D.G. Kelly. And this is, I actually agree with this particular answer. So we only look at the system we control. He says that this is education in the 21st century. This is modern and exact social science. This is the university course in History 102. And this is what we have inherited from the original, designed and constructed by the white architects of education. The lesson I take from this is that we are to create new models of pedagogy and intellectual work and become architects of our own education. Then we cannot simply repair the structures that have been passed down to us. We need to dismantle, disrupt the old architects so that we might begin anew.
Thank you. Thank you. Siobhan?
In my perfect utopia, and I think some of this has to do with my background and just how I was trained and the fact that I was a practicing attorney for years, a lot of it for me is legislative deconstruction. At what point do we make quality education a constitutional right in this country? And if we were to do so, that would actually impact the resources. If it's a constitutional right and you're looking at disparities in education, the only way to combat that argument is looking at the best school and making sure you offer all of the children in this country that best education. That's an easy hit if there is will, if there is legislative will to do so, change the Constitution. If there is judicial will for our attorneys to push those cases through, because there's been a lot of those cases that have been popping up across the country already. But it also speaks to that deeper piece that Attorney King just spoke of around what the system was constructed for. Because if we actually do a legislative fix and we actually declare education the right that it is, it blows the rest of our system up. Because at the end of the day, your property tax system fails. So now everybody lives wherever they want to if they can afford the property. People's protected class based on socioeconomics fail because all of a sudden you have a rising class of people that are as educated as those that protect themselves by educating their children in private schools.
Thank you. Cameo.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, that was it. My first one would be definitely to cut away our educational dollars being based on the income of the community. I mean, first and foremost, because as just mentioned, that changes everything. My second, my utopia would be for our students to have mega donors involved in their institutions. Far too often, and unfortunately, in this capitalistic society, we see everyone else benefiting from these networks of donors, and while even our HBCUs and our schools are getting some great donors as of late and sponsorships, I want to see mega donors, going from the millions to the 100 millions, as we know some of our institutions are getting, that are for predominantly white students. So we need to make those systems available for our students, our schools. And I think one of the other factors was just mentioned, and disrupting what education really means for our students. You know, so often do we get caught in just, you know, saying education, get educated. And right now, you know, many of our students who are on the outside looking in, you know, they're trying to redefine what education looks like as well. And while, you know, we're doing, you know, our best to make sure that they receive a quality education, we know students have diverse need. So in that utopia, we got to be able to address and go back to, you know, being able to educate students in those skill fields, just as much as, you know, in our liberal arts field, so that they feel prepared all around the board. And it's not this constant, you know, argument, you know, is college for me or is it not? Is the public education system for me or is it not? You know, this is a place where regardless of what you need, you can come and get your education.
Thank you. And Christina and April, we were running out of time, so I put your hand down. Thank you. What I want to do now, before I turn it over to my co-chair, Kim, to close us out, I'm just going to ask everyone to just share one word. You leave here, you're leaving here now. What is one word that you want to share with our audience and with the other panelists here? One word. And can we go around now? One word. You can just call it out. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Someone said we were outstanding. All right, so come on, panelists, give us one word. Oh my God. Say it again. Oh, who was it? Dana, what did you say?
I said hope. Oh, go ahead, Tony.
I was just saying encouraged.
Encouraged, thank you. Siobhan?
I was saying hopeful, hope.
Dana King?
Motivated.
Okay. Christina?
Mine is they are our responsibility.
Okay. Mulka?
Ownership.
Okay. Dave?
Courage.
Zara?
Inspire.
Allie?
Ooh, strength.
Tony went. Latanya?
Advocate.
April?
Accountability.
Cameo?
Relentless.
This, and I'm powerful. Powerful. Kim?
Mine would be privilege. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to make a difference in these children's lives. You can't judge a book by its cover. Children walk up, we make assumptions, and we're blown away by what we find. So I would say privilege. It's a privilege to teach these children.
Okay, Kim, you were closing us out.
Okay, so thank you. This was amazing. We appreciate all of your time, energy, effort, your insight, your experience. It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And I think we have some more questions in the Q&A. If you guys could address them individually, that would be fantastic. And I want to thank you all. I think it was very successful, and hopefully we can do it again next year.
Yeah, or in between next year. I see a lot of people, a lot of the comments were about how do we keep this going to make that change. And I think that this is powerful, and I think we should. Sean, do you want to close out and say anything as we close?
I just want to thank you and Kim. I think you two did an amazing job with this program. I think it's definitely something that's needed. I like the idea of continuing the series, so just let me know how we need to get that to happen. But you did an amazing job, and thank you to all the panelists today. Thank you for the work today, but also just thank you for the work that you do every day.
Thank you. And I'd like to say hi to Bernice Henry. I haven't seen her in years. Hi, Bernice. Thank you. It was wonderful.
And thank you to all of the participants who asked questions, who were engaged via chat, whether it was reflection or question and answer. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Onward and upward.
Hey, thank you.